upcoming retirement of SharePoint 2010-2013 workflows and their potential migration to Power Automate. Just going to kick off the discussion with first just to go through our agenda of what we're going to cover today. And this is intended to be an interactive session. So if anyone has any questions as we are going through this, please raise your hand in Teams and type your question out in the chat window. And the moderator, who's Alan Scott, will let me know about those questions, and I will try to address them as we are going along the discussion. Again, thank you for joining. We'll just quickly do a quick round of introductions. And my name is Akil Haider. I'm the VP of Technology for Cambay Consulting. I work on the M365 and Azure stacks of the technology platform from Microsoft. Been doing this for over 18, 19 years now, and been involved with SharePoint ever since its first version in 2001. Sadly, that is also giving away my age, but it's been a fun career built around SharePoint. So let's quickly get into this. First, let's cover what is being retired, and let's be very clear about that. Microsoft last year, or earlier this year actually, announced that they were going to retire SharePoint 2010 workflows. What does that mean? That means that any workflow that is executing or has been built on SharePoint 2010's workflow engine and is currently either deployed, has been deployed on your on-premise location, whether it is a 2013 farm but was built in 2010 and moved over, or it is a 2010 workflow that is deployed on SharePoint Online using that workflow engine, or a third-party tool for that matter, like Nintex and so forth. All those workflows will effectively stop working November 1st. As of August 1st, you couldn't even create the workflows anymore as you provision new tenants, and on November 1st, those will be those actually stopped working and have started being deprecated. There's another note down there which is very clear, that there's been no effective announcement for the 2013 workflows to be retired. Those are workflows that are executing on SharePoint on-prem 2013 workflow engine, or that have been deployed in SharePoint Online. But we are expecting that sometime in 2021, those will also be effectively, some announcement will come from Microsoft that will lead to them getting retired. SharePoint 2013 workflows are deprecated but will remain supported. The other thing I want to also make sure you understand is that if you have SharePoint on-prem 2010, it's not yet suddenly your workflows that you've been using will stop working. You'll just go into unsupported mode because Microsoft is no longer supporting those technologies. If you are using a SharePoint Online, or you've migrated, or you're in a hybrid mode, then the story is that you will not be those workflows will stop working in the cloud. Your actions, your triggers, your logins, all of that will stop working effectively November 1st. So what is the migration path? The migration path is very clear. Microsoft had announced the Power Platform over the past year and a half, 2 years, in fact, longer than that. They have been actively advertising it. They have been adding capability on Power Automate. It used to be called Microsoft Flow. When it was first launched, it had very limited capability. Now it's a fully functional workflow engine, in my opinion. And PowerApps has come up as a great interface to build extremely powerful Canvas and model-driven applications to redo info path and designer type workflows and or third-party workflows that were based on technologies like Nintex and so forth. The other key thing to understand is that Microsoft Power Apps and Power Automate we're going to spend a little bit of time covering what they're all about and why does it make sense to actually go with these technologies as part of the as part of an upgrade or a migration path. They're platform independent. You can actually have a Power App that can interface with multiple devices. It can sit and execute tasks across the board. And I'll cover all of that as we go through this session. So the idea is that basically you move the workflows from SharePoint 2010 move to the Power Platform. Power Platform has three major components. It has the Power Apps component, which is basically to help you build the user interface at a very high level. Things like your Canvas apps, you can build very nice you can build very intuitive and robust form designs using the no-code IDE that comes as part of the solution. You also have the Power Automate engine, which is basically the old Microsoft Flow engine, which has been rebranded and much more additional functionality has been added to it to provide a business process automation engine for actions and triggers and so forth. And then on the reporting side, you have the Power BI platform for your data visualization piece, which is not the scope of our discussion today, but you have that ability. The other key thing to understand is that the Power Platform leverages the common data service. It can connect across the workloads in Office 365, M365. It can talk to D365. It can connect to more than 250 data connectors exist today, and we're going to cover some of that as we go across. Or it can be as simple as storing your data in SharePoint lists and leveraging that as your data model and data source. Or it can talk to the Azure Data Factory, for example, or the Azure SQL Server instance in which you might be storing and consuming data in a relational database. And we'll go through some of those design patterns as we cover the migration approach. Very quickly, you have the ability in Power Apps to, it's a very simple, today's scope is not to cover everything in Power Apps. We've had a workshop on that. Hopefully you attended that. If not, let us know and we can invite you to our next one. It's got a WYSIWYG editor. It allows you to create app logic with very familiar Excel-like expressions. You can mash up data and from multiple sources. So if you have data that you need to connect to from different third-party connectors, as I talked about, all of that can be very simply built into designing robust forms that are actually responsive, so you don't have to do anything else. And these forms can then be leveraged to connect to your applications that are going to consume that data from different sources. So we've got more than 250 connectors today. Some of these are premium connectors. Some of them are available at no cost. You can easily go and read up on these documentations. But if you actually have data from multiple sources, which in the previous version of SharePoint in 2010 and 2013, you were somehow through some ETL framework were bringing into SharePoint, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can actually connect to all these third-party systems. Again, not the scope of our discussion, but the idea is to provide you the thought process that we have the ability to connect to all these different types of data sources. You basically have these powerful connectors. They can bring in the data. You can then store the data in the CDS, or you can actually store it in SharePoint and then manipulate it, do what you want with it, and your triggers and so forth can be built on that particular list. The idea again is that you have citizen developers. In the old days, you would have to have somebody with technical skills to actually write these workflows. The concept is that you basically drive that away from IT to the business. You train people on how to use the PowerApps IDE, you train them on how to do things, and then they're able to build and deploy their own simple workflows. You can compartmentalize those workflows to particular site collections that those users have access to, so that they don't particularly impact your production environment. Once you've actually checked that they're doing things properly, you can then move those items across. All of this is what used to be called Office 365 groups. It controls and allows people to perform these actions. You can leverage PowerShell to include and exclude people from having this ability. So people within your IT infrastructure, within your enterprise don't willy-nilly have access to go and create flows. A governance model that you can apply to control who does what from a coding perspective. As I already mentioned, it has the ability to be platform agnostic. So you can instantly publish to iOS, Android, Windows, and the web. So regardless of where somebody is coming in from, as long as they have the Power App on their mobile phone, they can approve items, they can reject items, they can put content in it, they can reroute for additional review and so forth. And sharing apps is pretty much like sharing documents. You are no longer bound to you're no longer bound by the app itself as it was previously tied to a web client or something like that. In the older versions, the app can actually coexist independently. So people can, yes, definitely come and leverage SharePoint from a SharePoint online site, or they can actually just use the Power App on their phone or their iPad or even their Windows machine to get to it and perform their actions. Now, what is Power Automate at a very high level? It again, like Power Apps, it's intended to allow non-developers to develop simple workflows. You can get notifications, you can copy files, you can perform actions, you can actually do a lot of advanced level stuff as well. But from a very simple perspective, you can collect all the data, automate the approvals, even has RPA capabilities and so forth from building bots and things like that to improve response time for automating help desk, for example. All these capabilities are now available on the tool, and it's important to understand those capabilities ahead of retiring and migrating any of your 2010 or 2013 workflows. The reason I'm spending a little time on introducing the technologies is to make sure that we understand what the target system looks like, to which we are identifying as a new version of where to move your workflows to. As a quick example, what makes up a flow in Power Automate? You have a very simple thing. You have a trigger. This is something which is at a very high level, the event that kicks off the workflow. This can all be this could be a manually controlled trigger. Somebody can actually go in and click on it and execute that trigger. For example, it could be on a schedule, so you can say that at midnight every night, grab everything in this list and execute the workflow on all of these items. Or it could be an event in the cloud. If it's a connected workflow and it's talking to a third-party system through a connector, If something happens on that third-party system and it receives that information, then it can execute that trigger. Actions are what the flow does and can use the data from the trigger. So essentially, you have the ability in Power Automate, like you did in the old designer workflows and in text and all the other tools, essentially to create actions based upon what is happening with the trigger to go and execute some to as simple as a task of sending an email, for example. And you have it exposes an extremely rich API. There are fields that you can auto populate. You can add dynamic content to it. You can hard code things if you want, but you have all of this is all possible from the IDE of Power Automate. It's not at all very complicated, and within by getting trained in Power API, Power Apps and Power Automate for like maybe a day or two, your citizen developers, as I indicated, will have the capability to manage their own workflows and build and deploy simple applications on SharePoint online. Last but not least, as I mentioned, there are 170 out-of-the-box connectors, with new connectors being added every week. It is now up to 250. Some of these are premium connectors. For example, if you're connecting to Salesforce or you're connecting to other third-party SaaS-based providers like ServiceNow or things like that, there are costs to it. One thing I did not mention here is that Automate also has the ability, for example, to connect to Microsoft Azure and execute custom scripts that you might have written, or it can execute an Azure job function. It can execute an Azure job, which you can create in your tenant to perform certain action and return the result set. Very simple use case for a customer that we implemented recently was the ability to the Power Automate flow contacted the Azure instance. We executed a script to add and remove team members from Microsoft Teams within their tenant, and based upon the incoming request, which was populated by a Power Apps form sitting on top of a SharePoint list. And then that once that was approved, the people were automatically added or removed from those MS Teams on their tenant. This solved for them the dependency on adding people manually to every team. If you have 50 team members, it was quite a tedious task. So it solved that problem. But I'm just giving you a very tactical example of things that you can actually do very quickly. And it took me about 4 hours, no, even less than that. I would say 2 hours to do the whole project. And within 2 hours of testing, I was ready to deploy it into production. Having said that, I wouldn't recommend that you deploy something into production in 4 hours, but the point is that your development time and time to market significantly has shrunk with this capability that now is available in Office and M365. Let's talk, we're going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes talking about the SharePoint workflow migration process. And I've covered what is going to retire, just to recap, what your technology, particular choices for technology are, to which technology platform you should be considering to migrate those workflows that are retiring. And now we're going to talk about, well, okay, we know that, we know how things, we know what is reaching its end of life. We know what technology to get there. Well, tell us how to do that. Okay, great question. And that's what we're going to focus the rest of our discussion here today on. And basically, we have a framework and a process and a methodology at Cambay Consulting that we have created. Obviously, looks very simple, but I'm going to walk you guys through how we built this framework and what its repeatable value is, that if you work with us, we can help you with this process. The uh, the first thing that we have on our agenda is going to be the discovery and scope definition. Uh, I was recently involved with a customer and they said they had 8 or 10 workflows on their SharePoint farm. I said, okay, that's a very simple migration. When we actually ran some PowerShell scripts to discover how many, they had over 140 workflows. They did not even know that certain workflows had been written in SharePoint Designer by their business users who had been executing and running those approval workflows and other amongst other actions that they were doing. So the first and foremost thing is to understand and create a inventory matrix of all the different workflows that you have within your organization. You will ask me on how to do that. I'm going to very simply say that this is possible using PowerShell scripts, and you as IT admins or IT pros can very simply execute those PowerShell scripts to collect that data, or you can connect with us and we can help you with that. This inventory, once it's created, will not only let you know you need to collect certain types of data. When you, it's not just that, okay, I have this workflow. No, you have to actually get the what the workflow does, the actions that it, as I mentioned, it executes, the triggers that it has, the data that it collects, how long is that data preserved within SharePoint, how many average runs are you executing this workflow for. That's very important because it has licensing impact on how often your workflows are going to run in the cloud from a Power Automate perspective. And you also need to collect who is the primary owner of this workflow, and also things like which business unit is executing this workflow. If you have multiple copies of the same workflow, you need to understand why those multiple copies were made and what were the business reasons behind it, and document all of these things. Essentially, it's a full-blown discovery across your enterprise on your on-prem 2010 or 2013 farm to understand what type of uh, footprint of workflows do you currently have. The next phase, which is very important, is in parallel while you are defining and collecting all this information, you are going to impact all these businesses, and you're going to introduce a disruption to their way of operations. As we all know, human beings are resistant to change, and we have for if I'm not mistaken, but if people in organizations are still using SharePoint 2010 workflows, I'm assuming that they've been doing that for at least a decade or close to it. And if that's the situation, you're going to run into a situation of how things have always been done. In order to mitigate the risk around service disruption and business continue to enforce that business does not get impacted, and to make sure business continuity is available, you need to create a change management plan. You need to understand exactly which workflows will be moving when, which users will be impacted, and what your training plan is for the users. I'm talking about specifically on end users consuming the workflows, not necessarily the people who are going to be authoring them in the new environment. The other key plan to understand over here is also going to be a migration of the old data associated with those workflows. There are many business processes that have been automated by our customers that require them post completion of the workflow to archive and store the data for legal purposes, for discovery purposes, or for compliance reasons that are otherwise defined in their industry. If that is your use case and user scenario, you need to create a repository to handle the old migrated data and provide for, through the search engine, an easy way for your users to be able to search for that content and be able to get to that content post migration to the new system. The other key point to also understand here is that, as I said earlier, people would have been doing this for a while in a certain paradigm, in a certain environment. It's also very important to build consensus and to bring people along to the new technology. You have to show how it will make their lives easier. You have to show how things will get better. I highly recommend that we do this through a communication plan that is conceived and documented early, before a migration begins, so that we are repeatedly giving opportunities to your users to be able to attend learning sessions, to attend lunch and learns, and other office activities that were prevalent before. But obviously with COVID, we don't have the face-to-face interaction. So it's important that not just flooding somebody's inbox with emails, but having the regular communication through Teams, through chat, through other updates on channels that everyone is subscribing to. It's important to post information about what the changes are as and when they are going to come and evolve. So it's very important that you create this change control process and you create a communication plan around the change control process as and when it evolves. The next thing is going to be the migration planning activity. As I mentioned earlier, the inventory would have been created in the discovery phase. The idea now will be around documenting and creating a full-blown project plan on, and creating a mapping of all the capabilities that you're going to need. So how many SharePoint sites are you going to create in the SharePoint online version? Which workflow is going to go to which particular site? What are all the custom actions or out-of-the-box actions that you're going to need? Are there third-party connectors, as I had earlier covered, that you're going to need? Or are you going to create a local data model in SharePoint lists? What are your data sources? And you have to be very, very clear in identifying these, because they will have a direct impact on your cost. Your data sources are key, because a lot of time on-prem systems in SharePoint Online might only be talking to SharePoint lists, but then you realize that somebody has written some connectors to pull data in from third on-prem data sources. This is a big one that we run into our customers whenever we are interacting with them. They think that the workflow is operating only on data stored in SharePoint. While that is true, the refresh of that data and the update of that data is consistent and constant through, sometimes, for example, a SQL server on premise might be talking to the SharePoint instance through a gateway and pushing data into SharePoint. And the people who did that are not in communication with the admin people and so forth. And so it's important to identify these data sources. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, you need to create a documented list of triggers that you're going to need for each of these workflows. Essentially, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to create an end-to-end process in Visio or any other tool of your choice if you're not a Visio fan. And you're going to end up creating the process diagram, as well as a stepwise state machine diagram on what triggers change, what actions take place at each state, what triggers those actions, and what happens at each state of the workflow from its inception through its input, process, output for each state of the machine, and who are the actors that are acting on those actions that are taking place. It's very important to create this. A lot of times it's not documented, it's in people's heads. Simple things like, oh, why do I need to do this? Because you want to have consistent results as and when you go on to the next phase of the migration. When you actually implement it in SharePoint Online using PowerApps, or if you implement it in PowerApps minus SharePoint Online, it has to at minimum meet the business functionality. It's also good at this stage to get the business involved and to talk to them and make sure that what you have documented is agreed upon. A sign-off process to is a industry-wide recommendation to ensure that items are not missed and that business is not is requirements are satisfied when you are actually deploying the new system. One thing I would add here is that whenever we are doing this with different customers, a lot of times when we are implementing systems or migrating systems, there are net new requirements. Two things happen. One is there were limitations of the technology when the original workflow was built, so the entire business process might not have been fully automated. And those limitations force the business stakeholders to adopt their business process to those limitations within the technology and to work around it. That might result in net new business requirements or questions being asked as, hey, can it do this? And the second thing is that they just have improved their internal business process and might have added a few steps on how to do things, but they were waiting for the migration to happen to share those new business requirements. My approach has been twofold. Sure, we can implement them during the migration. It adds additional complexity and additional cycles around the migration path. And if there is latitude in the schedule and there is plenty of resource availability, it's probably a good thing to do. So that when you go into the new system, you actually have a fully functional workflow, which is an enhanced version of the previous version, but it also provides this additional net new functionality. The disadvantage with this approach is that obviously your level of testing normally goes 1.5 to 2x up, because not only do you have to check against all the use cases and test cases of the previous version of the workflow, but you also have to test against the newer net new functionality that didn't exist before, and therefore all permutations and combinations thereof. So the big O of the algorithm from a testing perspective is actually n square. People on the computer science side will know what I'm talking about, and you want to avoid that. Hence, the recommended approach is to at least get the baseline functionality implemented in the new system, migrate the users, migrate the application, retire the old application, and then have a version 1.1 or a 1.2 release to provide that additional capability so that each piece can be compartmentalized and you're not doing a big bang approach. However, certain customers say, no, we want to do all in one go, which is fine, which can be done. It just adds additional complexity to your process. As I mentioned earlier, you can, leveraging the citizen developer model, you can scale and develop your solutions in PowerApps and Power Automate. You essentially Now, once you have all your workflows documented, you can go and create these workflows, and you can compartmentalize this action within each uh, uh, SharePoint online site collection or as an standalone application. The point here is that you're not going to impact anything in production. The citizen developer is constrained to that particular model, to that particular site or site collection. His or her actions don't necessarily impact anything that is happening at the tenant level. I mean, don't hold me to that, but you really have to know what you're doing, and you really need to be a techie in order to perform certain things that can impact your tenant. But I'm assuming that most people that you will be developing these won't know what on how to deliberately do something bad. The other key thing I would add here is that the if you as an IT group or IT manager are struggling and you're saying, you know what, I've got 150 of these workflows that I have to migrate, you can offload some of the migration activities and tasks to those citizen developers after you have provided them training, as I mentioned earlier, so that individual business units can implement their own workflows and work hand in hand with them to get their new environment set up and ready. This can be effective where an organization from a cultural perspective has resources within those departments that are tech savvy. In other cultural organizations where people are not so tech savvy, this model might not work for everybody. Again, you know your organization, you know your culture, you know the people that are available. The other additional piece I would add here is that once people are learning and developing these apps, you also need to train them on the governance of their actions. Once they learn something on how to do something, they will have a lot of power. You also have to constrain them on, as I mentioned, through Office 365 groups. You need to control on which sites and which locations in SharePoint Online they can do these actions. And that, as I mentioned, is a membership-based action controllable resource that is available in Office 365 and M365. After you have developed and deployed your applications, you have to bring in the key business stakeholders. They obviously have to test and deploy all these workflows. But there are three key things to remember here. Their user interface of the way they were doing things in SharePoint or InfoPath or Nintex or what have you not would have completely changed. So you're going to run into a little bit of resistance on here, and be prepared for that. The other key thing to understand is that at least from a feature perspective, if you've built this right, they'll be able to come in, as I mentioned in the past, with BYOD. They can come in from their iPad, they can come in from their mobile phone, and I think it's important to train them on that and show them the value add of doing this in the online version. Of course, there are many more dependencies on that working properly, but the capability of the tool is there. When you actually bring in the stakeholders and the business people to test all the workflows end to end, ensure that all the test cases that you had highlighted in your inventory from the use cases, from your process flow diagrams are checkmarked and ticked off as working properly in UAT. Otherwise, include time here, at least on one sprint level, to do some bug fixing and regression testing and so forth and blah blah blah. Most of the times we do find issues here and there, but if you've done your due diligence, this should be a relatively smooth process. The last but not least in the actual execution and decommissioning of the workflows. You have to create a clear cutoff plan. which needs to be, this is why I mentioned earlier that you have to have a communication plan. So you're constantly communicating that the system's going to be flipped over after such and such weekend or such and such date, and that your legacy application sites are going to be retired, and those that content is going to be converted to read-only. So the first thing I'd like to share here is an industry-wide best practice is that you need to you still need, from a business perspective, you will have certain workflows executing in the old system given a cutover plan regardless. So and you have to handle those as an exception basis. If there are 1,000 items in a SharePoint list and 5 or 10 of them are going to be executing at midnight on a Sunday when you're doing the cutover, you have to know what they are, and you can get the state of those workflows in the old system very simply by converting that site and that workflow to read only. You can see that at that moment in time when you did this action, which ones were executing, and you have to go and handle those manually, or you can talk to the business and recreate those workflows, that data input into the new system in SharePoint Online, and then they can go through the execution path again. But it's an 80-20 rule. You don't want to spend 80% of your effort in 20% of the value that you're going to get if you're going to try to migrate those over in some sort of an automated way. The first step, of course, as I mentioned, is you're going to convert the old legacy application sites to read only. This will block the users from adding any new data to it. You're going to have a content freeze. You are going to create a banner or other things on that site redirecting users to the new application site in SharePoint Online or the Power App that you have built. And for the next few days until post-production support for at least 15 to 30 days is done, you should leave that up there. The content associated with that site can then be moved into a records management repository in SharePoint Online, if that's your choice, or to some other records management solution in your enterprise if you have it. And then once all the people are now using the new system, you can go in there and bring tracking capability on how things are going, and you can provide post-production support to the application in the new area. The key thing to remember here is that the cutover plan will always have at least 5 to 10% of executing workflows. Our suggestion is handle those as an exception and communicate with the stakeholders involved rather than trying to automate them. One other piece I would also make sure that you've heard throughout this, I didn't mention it earlier, but should be obvious that there is no direct way to migrate and pull these applications out. You have to go through this process that I've just explained. Last but not least, as I said, create and document a governance plan. If this wasn't obvious when I first started, should have been. It's important that you govern your new environment. You know exactly what your citizen developers are allowed to do or not allowed to do for that matter, what their scope of operations are. It's important to also understand that as I mentioned earlier, the net new requirements that might have come out during the migration should be considered, where you can actually enhance the capabilities, you can optimize your workflows, you can improve the business process, you can provide much more capability through the actions that I described. It's not the scope of our discussion to go into a deep dive of all the different types of actions that are possible in Flow, in Power Automate. And so it's important that you know what those are, and when businesses ask you those questions, to get yourself educated on the platform. and also to collect metrics on the execution of the workflows so that you can appropriately license your technologies, you can appropriately um, address any concerns that you might have around what users get to do what. And last but not least, you can report to management and senior leadership on the success and overall consumption of your your data and so forth. Therefore, it's, as I said, the governance plan is key. Defining the role structures around it and so forth is also very key. And again, making sure that it is in place, people are educated about it, and are aware of it is important. One thing I like to add before I wrap up is that as I mentioned, in the old days, people used to lock down SharePoint Designer and Nintex and other tools, K2, whatever, access and code deployment, you could very easily lock it down. In the online environment, by default, things are turned on. And so it's important that your governance plan addresses that. If things are turned on, that means people with citizen developer skill sets, after you've trained them, will have the ability to create these workflows and create powerful forms and so forth. And trust me, its success is also a dangerous thing. It's scary because people now can really use the tool to do a lot of cool things. That's all well and dandy, but within an organization, you want to make sure that these users are trained and are capable and able to ensure that there is no data leakage, that there is a DLP in place, that there is that willy-nilly people are not sending emails to external users, things like that that you need to be aware of. If the requirement of the workflow is to do that, sure, but be aware and document those things as part of your governance plan, and so that you are aware if you do get audited or you have to report into your stakeholder that this is a potential for some type of data leakage, that you can mitigate the risk associated with that. So having said that, we are at 9:49 a.m. my time, which is Pacific Standard Time. We are actually at next steps. I will quickly cover this with you and then hand it back to our moderator, who's Alan Scott on the call. There are three things that we are offering as next steps as an organization. One is a 1-week POC on info platform migration to PowerApps. If you within your organization today have a InfoPath footprint and you need to retire that InfoPath form associated with SharePoint Designer workflows, we can do a quick POC to win things with your leadership and your organization as an offering that we have. The same thing with we can also POC one of your key business processes in SharePoint 2010 to Power Automate through the framework and the process that I just described, and it will allow you to win over people within your organization to agree that this is a viable solution and this is where you should go to. The third last one is an 8-hour discovery workshop solution. This is a strategic migration solution approach piece that we have. What this does is that you will sit down with our architects and our solution architects and our business analysts and our team, and we will sit down with you. And when I say sit down, it's all virtual these days, but it could be physical, hopefully, once things get back to normal. And we basically go through what you saw today was at a 1,000 feet level. We bring it down to 100 feet level, and we look at your environment, we understand things, and the outcome of this is you get not a detailed project plan, but you get a plan on how to handle a migration within your enterprise. It's a great activity that a lot of our customers have leveraged in the past. It is something that can help you build consensus within your organization of what the migration path is supposed to be, but also can highlight some risks, some and strategies thereof to mitigate them. And it can also provide you with a detailed timeline, schedule, cost at a very high level of what it's going to take to implement this project within your enterprise. So with that, I think I am concluding all the things that I had to talk about. As I said, roughly 50 minutes, 52 minutes, and so we have some time for some questions at this point. Alan, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's webinar, and thanks, Akil, for great insight. This has been really very helpful. At this time, I don't see any questions coming up from any of our attendees today. So thanks, everyone, again for kind of joining today's webinar. As a next step, you would get a thank you email with the webinar recording, and we will also work on some of the next steps. We'll be more than happy to work with any of you guys wanted to have a one-to-one discussion with our subject matter expert. We'll be more than happy to schedule that meeting with you. I will just give one last minute to see if we have any questions. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking out the time and joining this today's workflow migration to Power Automate webinar. We will look forward to connecting with you guys again for future webinars. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.